the delay this morning. The camera is giving me problems again. It only wants to behave in certain ways. We're finishing up Siman 59, Nun test, and we're going to start 60. So we're going to finish up about errors in the blessing of Yotzer Or, and then we're going to talk about whether the brachos of Kriya Shema need intention. But let's finish up where we left off last time. So if someone makes a mistake in the blessing of Yotzer Or, and we say that it could be a situation where you might have to actually switch them out. If the mistakes or let's say their lack of consciousness happens where we say kadosh, 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 and that part, and so on, the second person who steps in can step in from the place where they took a break. You have to start the blessing over again. So there's we talked about earlier about what it meant to mess up the bracha, and now we're talking about where you're messing up the actual text itself. We'll come back to that in a second. So the Ramah adds, so if you start from the part of where you start the Kedusha, okay, so we start talking about Tisbrach, Surenu, that from that section over there, Besed are you, source of these things. You've already gone through, you've already gone through the other parts of it. You've already gone through the acrostic, that little acrostic poem at the beginning right after the blessing of Yotzer Or. But before you start the Kadosh part of it, you are making an error. So we need to sometimes switch people out. So the Mishna Berurah says the following. He says, okay, so the person lost their place. Okay, that is part of the issue, and so they can't remember how to get back, and they don't have the siddur in front of them. So you start with the words start with ha'ofanim mechayos hakodesh, right, which is that part over there. Okay, or lokel baruch ni'imos yitenu. Okay, from those two sections, those are considered part of the kedusha, and that's where you make the mistake. So if you make the mistake in that first paragraph, v'ha'ofanim mechayos hakodesh, then you start from the words v'ha'ofanim. Okay, if you make the mistake with El Baruch Ni'imos Yitenu, you start there. So if you flip open your Art Scroll Siddur to those pages, and I didn't leave an Art Scroll Siddur next to me for today. My bad. I thought I left one behind me. And so if you get to those places, then you need to go back to them from that spot. Okay. This is different than what we're going to learn by the laws of tefillah. In the laws of tefillah, you have to start from the beginning of the bracha. So if someone doesn't know what they're doing, and you have to replace them in the middle of the tefillah, then you need to start from that blessing, and not after it, not before it. But this is different because we're starting with the words kadosh. It's kind of like its own blessing. That's the reason for this halacha this way. So the Ramah adds, if you make a mistake and forget where you are before you get to Kedusha, you have to go back to the beginning. Okay? And we're not, because the same, it says that's where the rule will be the same as by tefillah, where you don't break up the blessing into two parts. Okay? So that halacha applies when you're trying to fulfill the obligation everybody else saying it. There's one siddur in the whole town, and everyone needs you to fulfill the obligation. Okay, nowadays the custom is a little different. Since everybody is reciting the blessings along with the shliach tzibur, and no one is actually intending for the shliach tzibur to fulfill their obligations, if the shliach tzibur doesn't know what's going on in the middle of the blessing, in any bracha in Shema, not including the brachas of tefillah. So then you can't have the second person come in there and start from that spot. That's what the Mishna Berurah's understanding is. Okay? Okay? So the and that's when. So the reason why this is, since nowadays we aren't fulfilling the obligations, and someone isn't basically reciting it along with him, you are not allowed. You are not allowed to go ahead and pick up from that spot. Okay, unless he adds, you can't start from the middle of that bracha unless you haven't recited it yourself. So if you're at the same spot as the shliach tzibur, then you could pick up from that spot. But if you don't, then start the bracha over again. So it would be great if the shliach tzibur for whatever reason can't continue, or let's say chas v'shalom, they passed out in the middle. You put someone else there who can start from that spot. If they are up to that spot now, then they can continue from that spot with kedusha. And if they haven't started reciting it, they can catch up and then start reciting that blessing on their own. Okay, so that is the end of Siman 59. We're going to start with Siman Samech 60. These are the blessings of Kriya Shema, if you need to have intent for them. Okay, and in here we're going to talk about the blessing of Ahavas Olam, or Ahava Rabbah. Okay, so the Sephardic custom is to recite Ahavas Olam, and the Ashkenazi custom is Ahava Rabbah. This machlokas goes all the way back to the Talmud about how this blessing starts out. Now, this blessing doesn't start with Baruch Atah Hashem because it's considered a bracha hasamucha lachaverta. It's considered adjacent to the other bracha. We've talked about this a number of times before. Bracha hasamucha lachaverta, just a quick refresher. It means that in the course of composing blessings, we do not make a bracha open and close with Baruch Atah Hashem if it is immediately adjacent and not interposed with any other text that would separate between the initial bracha and the later ones. And so therefore we only conclude those blessings with it. And in that way we are stylistically connecting this bracha with the first one that lists it. So that's why for the Shemona Esrei, it starts with Baruch Atah Hashem, and then all the other remaining 17, 18 blessings all end with Baruch and don't start with it, because the first one begins the actual blessing of Shemona Esrei itself. Okay? So, and we learned earlier back in chapter 47 about whether or not you can fulfill your obligation for Berachos Torah with Ahava Rabbah. We talked about that Shema doesn't count and that you would start learning Torah immediately afterwards. So that was some of the rules that we saw previously. Okay? The reason why we recite Ahava Rabbah in the morning, and at night for Ashkenazim we recite Ahavas Olam, and differently than the Sephardim, is because we believe that in the morning we want to say that we are trying to greet Hashem first thing in the morning. So if you accidentally recited Ahavas Olam in the morning, that's okay, because you're still talking about being a Yotzer Me'oros. Okay. Now, that was some of the kavanah that you need for that blessing, is to think about fulfilling our obligation for Berachos Torah and reciting stuff later. And that Shema is not an interruption. But not only is Shema not an interruption, we're in the Sakhan Lacha over here. If you recite Kriya Shema by itself without the blessing of Yotzer or an Ahava Rabbah or Ahava Salam if you're Sardi, you have fulfilled the obligation of Kriya Shema. And then you recite the blessings without Kriya Shema. However, you would go ahead and repeat the Shema in the middle of those blessings, even if you recited it earlier. So we mentioned previously that the minhag in many Ashkenazic synagogues was to recite the Shema during Berachos HaShachar, because they would drag out Sukkot Zimra for a long time and miss the time for Shema. So he brings down over here that you should continue to do that. The reason why you can do this is because the Talmud taught us specifically that the mitzvah to recite the blessings of the Shema and the mitzvah of the Shema do not rely one on the other, and therefore if one is performed without the other, you fulfill the obligation for it. Okay? So even though you've recited the Shema, you still have a separate obligation to recite the blessings. And you can do that without that. Okay? However, you should still include the Shema in there because it's good to have some Torah learning in there because it will fulfill that need and that obligation for that for that recitation of the Shema. Okay. Okay, so we also talked about the time. So even if you recited the Shema within the first 3 hours of the day, so you can still recite the Shema later on because that that's the Divrei Torah that we're talking about. Okay, here's another important thing. The order of the blessings doesn't prevent one from fulfilling the obligation. So we mentioned previously about how if you got the second bracha wrong, mix it up, that's okay. But technically, you shouldn't take a break between the second blessing and the recitation of Shema. We just learned that in 59. But nonetheless, if you switch them out, you still fulfill the obligation of the blessings. Okay, so too, if you said Emes V'Yatziv before reciting Shema, the third blessing, and put that all the way somewhere else, that would work too. Now, you're not allowed to do that. Okay, so the third one is actually to be the most important, but we're not going to get into too much of that. Just remember to try to say all of these things. Okay. Okay, so one thing that seems to be agreed upon is that do you need all three of them to fulfill the obligation of reciting the Shema? Well, let's say you forgot to or don't remember. Okay, but maybe they don't prevent each other from fulfilling the obligation. Okay, and maybe there's only an obligation to recite it publicly. So if you're by yourself, as long as you've recited some of them, that should be okay. So that's an even bigger leniency that one could find. Okay. Halacha Daled. Some people say that mitzvos don't need intentions. You don't have to have in mind, I am fulfilling the mitzvah of this, right? And in this case, this is the mitzvah of Shema and the mitzvah of Berurah Shema. Some people say you do. Okay? And the Shulchan Aruch says, and that's the halacha, is you need to have intent to fulfill the obligation. So what does that mean? Well, on a very basic level, it means this. Okay? It means that if you don't intend to fulfill the obligation of the mitzvah, you don't fulfill the obligation for the mitzvah from the Torah, and you must perform it again. And if you're not sure if you did it, since we say that a doubtful performance of a mitzvah d'oraisa is one is to take the stringent assumption and assume you have not done it, you must do it again. However, if we were to take that approach, the Mishnah Berurah says that by the blessings you can be lenient, but you have to perform the mitzvah again. So you should probably not recite the mitzvah again. Okay, so that's why people who are just practicing doing something, practicing to learn the blessings, practicing Berurah Hamazon, practicing to blow the shofar, practicing to tie tzitzis, practicing with things that you would do with little children to teach them these different mitzvahs. And when someone had an obligation to perform the mitzvah and didn't intend to fulfill his obligation while teaching them, that would be a case of where you might have to do it again. So in those saying that mitzvahs don't need kavanah, they would say like this. And there's two forms of intent needed for a mitzvah. You have to intend your thought to the mitzvah itself, and you have to intend to fulfill the obligation. Okay, so just I'm doing this to fulfill the command of the Creator, blessed be He, Hakadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, so and this is what we mentioned back by Hilchos Tzitzis a long time ago. So it's not how you intend your thoughts to do the mitzvah, okay, but it means that you do it and your focus is on it. Okay, so you focus on saying the Shema, you focus on saying the Shema Esrei, you focus on reciting Berachas Hamazon, you focus on reciting Kiddush. Okay, so therefore, you should always do that. Now, if you didn't do that, but you performed it because you're here to do the mitzvah, then you still fulfill the obligation. Okay, so there's a question of whether or not you start the mitzvah. You have to make an actual statement to yourself if you are obligated. If you are intending to start the mitzvah in order to fulfill its obligation. So therefore, everyone agrees that the best thing to do is you have to focus yourself to fulfill the obligations, because there's something known as mitzvahs anashim milumada, that a person does something out of rote, okay, and that is not appropriate, okay. So you do them because they're part of your routine, and so the Vilna Gaon brings up also by the mitzvah tzitzis that you can't do that. That's not the proper way to do it. One other interesting statement over here about needing kavanah by the mitzvos. So, there's a question over here by Rosh Shlomo Kluger. He says, "What if I do the mitzvah, but I intend to not fulfill the obligation?" Okay, and he says, maybe by mitzvah derabanan, where I don't need kavanah. Okay, fine. Everyone agrees by that. But if I'm intending by other things to not fulfill the obligation. So he says that sometimes even if you do things by rote or by accident and you get the job done, okay, or you're in the course of doing something else and this thing happens, even if you make a statement, I'm not doing the mitzvah, but do it anyway. So he seems to say that even when you state explicitly that you're not doing this for the purpose of the mitzvah, you still fulfill the mitzvah. Okay, and so he says that. So, he says that he deals with this in a case of laws of mezuzah. He says that as long as you put it up, you're still fulfilling an obligation. And the only differences would be is that if you are sort of engaging in something but aren't really doing it, then that would be a notable exception, like we just said. But it's entirely possible that just being there, and just fulfilling it somewhat robotically, you could still do that. So it's an interesting thought of Rav Shlomo Kluger. It's just something to sort of think about. It's an interesting statement. So let's move on to halacha hey. So this will be the last one in the Siman. He says, if you recite the Shema and you don't focus on the first blessing, that Shema Yisrael means to calling your attention to it, then you do not fulfill your obligation. And the rest of the paragraph, if you just sort of recite it without focusing on what it means, even if you're reading the Torah or you're fixing the Torah and you want to make sure the parshios are written correctly and it happens to be the time for Kriya Shema, that's good. Okay, but you have to have in mind for the first pasuk as well. Even if the rest of it's being done to fix it, you have to have in mind to fulfill the mitzvah for the first pasuk. So this one, no one disagrees on. Okay, so so even though some people say that the mitzvahs do or do not require it, nonetheless, everyone agrees that you need to focus on the first line of Shema, on what that means. We'll come back to that in a second. Okay, so there's two things you need to do for the mitzvah of the first line of Shema. Okay, you have to intend to fulfill the mitzvah of Shema. Okay, and you also have to recite the Shema with your statement and not focus on something else. Okay, so that's what you have to do. Okay, let me see over here. Okay, and also what we can say is if all of these different parshios that you're reciting, that we said that even if you're trying to fix the Torah or adjust something and so on and so forth, if you have in mind to, at the beginning, have in mind to accept upon yourself the what's known as Ol Malchus Shamayim, the yoke of heaven, and you also have in mind that Hashem is the creator of the universe, that is what you need. Okay. Now, this is all important. Some people say you have to think about that for the length of that, but to be the lenient opinion is saying that you could do that even just at the very first pasuk of the Shema Yisrael, and in the rest, it wouldn't ruin it. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, let's get one more halacha in here. Okay. Now, okay. I think that's all we can really say. There's a lot of interesting things to talk about in terms of mitzvot shvichus kavana. Let's see. Okay, interesting point over here. So another focus point you need to have, according to the Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet, the 14th century famous rabbi, you have to have intent to recite. So even if you were trying to fix it and you're reciting it, you have to think about reciting it at the very least. Otherwise, you're not even doing the mitzvah because you have to explicitly say it. Okay. So that is, even if you're trying to fix it, when we say that you're reading it to fix it or make sure it's written correctly, you have to actually be reciting the words out loud. So from there, you can also learn a very important halacha that when you recite the Shema with full kavanah, you need to say the words out loud. So a couple fun halachas that come from this section over here. And the number one thing is you should have in mind to recite the Shema with the full intent of completing the mitzvah. You should focus on the meaning of the mitzvah, meaning that you're being called to pay attention to something important. You have to acknowledge the fact that Hashem is the master of all things. He's creator of everything. And you need to also acknowledge that he's the only one. That is the kavanah of the first pasuk. The kavanah for the rest of it means to recite it and know the translation, or at least the broad meaning of the words that you're reciting, and focus on what it's saying. So if you're not so good at it, we mentioned Rav Shlomo Kluger, who said that for rabbinic ones, as long as you are, even if you had intent to not complete it, as long as you're doing it, that's great. but you should really try to understand what it is that you are doing. And the Mishnah Berurah for sure says that whether it's a rabbinic or a Torah level mitzvah, so whether it's the blessings of the Shema or the Shema itself, there's disputes back and forth about which part of it is a Torah obligation, which part's a rabbinic obligation. You should always focus on knowing what the words mean and have the intent to recite it so that you can hear yourself reciting it and not be doing it to teach somebody else or to record yourself, let's say to teach somebody else the blessings, or you're in the middle of teaching a class. There actually is a famous story in the Talmud that that Rav Ashi used to be up so early giving his lectures that he would often pause for a moment while reciting the lectures in order to recite the Shema. And there was so he would be giving the lecture, and then they didn't, you may have been a good lecturer, but weren't necessarily an orator. So someone else would go and basically take what you said to your class in front of you. You would say a couple of points, and then an orator would go ahead and express it even more loudly to the rest of the crowd, or even translate it into another language they better understood. So that he often had a little break in there to recite the Shema, it says. And when he did that, the orator didn't repeat that part. So we will hold on the laws of the Shema for now. We have finished 1661. We'll talk more about the kavanas of Shema for next week, but we talked a little bit about it today. Thank you everyone for coming out, and we will meet you for more laws of the Shema next week.